Hi friends, my name is Katie Matthews and I'm the Executive Director at the Banquet Network. I am thrilled that you are joining me today. It means a lot to me, and not just because this is part of my job in training church leaders and church members on how to reach people with disabilities, but because this impacts me personally. I have several disabilities that you can't see when you look at me, and my son has several disabilities as well. And so I was on staff at my church as our children's director for a little over 8 years, and my husband was the pastor. And we had no clue how difficult attending church was for families impacted by disability until that became our story. And so, again, I am just incredibly thankful that you're taking the time to learn how to be more inclusive to families like mine. It means a lot. It is my hope and my goal today that I leave you with tools and resources so that you do feel equipped and able to do this. I dislike so much when I go to a conference and I'm inspired and I'm ready to do it, and I get all the handouts and I get all the things from the conference, and then I go back to my church and I'm like, I don't have a clue what I'm actually supposed to be doing here. I just have all these papers. And so that is not what I want to do today. What I want to do is leave you with actual tangible tools and resources in your toolbox that you can take back to your church and you can start implementing right away. So again, just thanks for joining me. It is such an honor, and let's get started. So we're going to begin by talking about 4 different types of classrooms, or 4 different types of environments, and that's an inclusive classroom, buddy systems, self-contained classrooms, and sensory rooms. And so the first one on that list is inclusive classroom. An inclusive classroom is exactly what it sounds like. It's a classroom that is inclusive to all different abilities and types of students, and they typically learn together in the general classroom. Some students can participate in this very easily, whereas others might need a little more accommodations in order to do that. But the overarching idea of an inclusive classroom is that it is the typical classroom that students would go to on a Sunday morning, and it includes children that have disabilities as well. We are going to just be talking about these types of classrooms at like a very high level, and we'll get into the details in a little bit. But some things to consider when creating an inclusive classroom is that you do need to be aware of each student's specific needs and maybe even their triggers so that you can accommodate them well. Some other ideas might be to sit that student next to a peer that could model good appropriate behavior or what is expected in the classroom. The idea of just implementing inclusive activities. So if you have a student that has mobility difficulties or like struggles with fine motor skills, you're not just gonna layer task after task after task that student can't participate in. So you may have heard of buddy systems or be familiar with this. A buddy system is when you pair a child with a disability either with a peer, another child, or an older student, perhaps a middle schooler or a high schooler, or an adult. And the role of that buddy is to assist the child in the normal activities of church life so that they can fully be a part of that. What a buddy, however, is not a babysitter. A buddy is also not to hover over that student the entire time. The buddy is just there to assist them and not do everything for them. And so an example of this might be, let's say your church does crafts during Sunday school, and a student of yours has a disability that impacts their fine motor skills. So maybe they have difficulty cutting paper. And so during the craft time, the buddy might cut the paper for that student, but then the buddy's going to allow that student to do the rest of the craft themselves unless they need additional help. And so the buddy's job is to just assist that student so that they can fully be a part of church. And that might mean kids ministry. That also might mean during the worship service, serving, or other things. Next up, we have specialized classrooms or self-contained classrooms. Some people use those words interchangeably. And what this is it's just a classroom that is a standalone classroom. It's by itself, and its intent is for the students with disabilities. Um, Lots of times when I'm working with churches, they automatically assume that this is what they need, maybe because they've done some research and they've seen that these exist. And there is a time and place for these, but not all churches need them. Um, my church happens to have a self contained classroom, and that's because some of our students have sensory needs that are extremely high, and even with accommodations and changes to our service, it's just not a good environment for them. And so we have a self contained classroom so that they can get those needs met and still go to church, and their families can worship, and they can still hear about Jesus and have a great time. Um, what a self contained classroom is it's not a place to hide students. We don't create self contained classrooms to put children with disabilities in corners or behind doors or so that people can't see them. It's because it's what they require to best meet their needs. So, my church actually does have a self contained classroom, and that is because several of our students have very high sensory needs, and with adaptations and accommodations to our service, we still just weren't able to meet those needs. So they have a self-contained classroom, and within that classroom, we actually have a sensory room. So what is a sensory room? Probably seen these. Everybody loves a good sensory room, but a sensory room provides alternative learning styles for students who need that, and it can serve multiple purposes. So some students need that increase in sensory. So they want to spend, they want the bright lights, they want all the tactile things. And so you can have things like that in the sensory room for them. Other students might not need that. They might need something more subdued that meets their needs. And so sensory rooms can accommodate both very easily. I also love sensory rooms because they're a great place to allow that reverse inclusion, to allow the kids without disabilities to hang out with the kids that do have disabilities. At my church, I constantly have to lock the door to our sensory room because toys go missing. There's always kiddos in there playing. They're just super excited to be in that room. And so it also creates this environment of fun, and not that there's a less than experience for the kids with disabilities. Because the other kids are actually a little bit jealous because they're like, hey, I want to go in there with the swings and the yoga balls and the cool toys. Um, so, yeah, a sensory room can provide stimulation or that subdued environment depending what they need. A sensory room, also, we're going to talk about this in a second, but it doesn't have to be these big flashy rooms that we see online when we Google sensory room. Sensory rooms can also help to establish structure and routine, and you could set up learning stations within them. Like I said, I have a self-contained classroom that has a sensory room in it. And once again, the intent is never to hide a student. It is always to meet that student's needs. So while there are lots of examples of big, elaborate sensory rooms, most churches that I know don't have the budget for that or even the space. And so here's some examples of sensory rooms in churches that I have seen. Here we have some labels on this one. You see some yoga balls and beanbag chairs and just simple things. I thought this was genius. They hung up a tent with command hooks. And the reason I love that so much is because sometimes things in disability ministry get messy. They get broken. They get torn down. And so this allows for that to happen without causing too much damage. They just put it back up with the command hooks. You see some toys such as slinky cars, trucks, trains. We'll talk about things like this in a bit, but using those child's preferences and things that they like to encourage them to be in the room. So trucks and trains and building toys and things like that. They also have puppets and some other items. Here's another example of a sensory room. You see the ball pit. I always encourage people not to go to specialty stores to buy things for their sensory rooms, but to go to IKEA, the Dollar Tree, Walmart. There might be some items that you do want to purchase and splurge on a bit, but again, disability ministry can be messy, and so you don't want to invest too much money in something that might get broken. Here we see the foam board on the wall and the foam mats on the wall and on the ground, as well as that bubble tube and the rocking chair. So here, a very simple sensory room, but also very effective. They had a student that would just like to swirl in circles and roam around, and so this gave that child the opportunity to still do that. They also have a bubble tube, they have a swing, some beanbag chairs, as well as some other lighting options. This is a church that I coached. Beautiful sensory room. Again, mats on the wall. Those are actually from IKEA, and they just velcroed them to the wall. And then lastly, this is an example of a little bit more of an elaborate sensory room in a church in Atlanta, Georgia. They have a projector on the wall projecting different images that you can see, as well as just some normal chairs and tables. And this is very similar to my church's sensory room in that we have the self contained classroom within our sensory room. So, how do you know where to start? I always encourage churches to start in house with their congregations. If you already have students that have disabilities, do they have needs that you could better be meeting? Some simple suggestions might be that perhaps you don't have a full space for a sensory room or a whole classroom that you can designate for a self contained classroom, but could you turn part of a classroom into a sensory area or maybe a corner of a classroom? I mean, I'm going to show you some examples in a moment, but maybe you just have sensory bags or sensory bins readily available for students who need those. And what that could look like is if a student's a regular attender, you could have a specialized bag that has all their favorite things in it. Or you could also just have bags readily available for any visitors. So let me show you an example. I just use these Rubbermaid containers from Target, and I have them labeled for students who attend more frequently. But in here are just some items, some generic items, but also items I know that they like. We have stress balls and plushies, some fidget items like this fun one. We also have these puzzle boards that you can weave. I've seen those at the dollar store. Slinkies, just some random things. People always end up giving me random stuff as well, including bubble wrap. I hoard this stuff because every student that I've ever had loves bubble wrap. We have some squish balls also from the Dollar Tree, bubbles, fidget toys. Everything I ever use pretty much comes from Amazon, Walmart, or the dollar store. Um, or it's just random stuff that I find. There is some putty in there and just more squish toys. So a bit of a leap in our thinking from going from squish toys and sensory toys, but um, I want you to think about what is the expectation in each part of your church service. And what I mean by that is if you were to look at the schedule of your church, what is expected during each time? So let's use the example of worship. During the worship service, what is the expectation? The church norm or the cultural norm is that we stand during worship, we sing. There might be like an outward expression. Either read the lyrics from a book or from the screen. People are loud depending on the type of church you go to or what your church prefers. You might even have bright lights or smoke machines. You might have one more of an acoustic setting, but there is a church norm. The norm is that you sit, you stand, you might raise your hands, but there's an outward expression of worship. And why that matters is because if we're looking at kids ministry and the cultural norm around kids ministry, there's a lot of expectations that might not be suitable for a kid with a disability. So with that, we keep in mind, what is the intent? So if the intent of a lesson is that children are learning about creation and they're safe, then how do we do that in the church setting? This goes back to some considerations when we were talking about those 4 different classroom strategies with the buddy system, with the self-contained classroom, sensory rooms, and the idea of just the inclusive classroom. And so some considerations when you're trying to decide what to do, especially if you're picking out a certain room, like you need to pick a classroom that will become the self-contained classroom or become the sensory room, is the placement of the room itself. Like, where is it located in your church building? Is it near the restrooms? Is that important? Is it near doors that go outside? Because you might have students that run. Is it close, though, to the sanctuary? So if parents want to drop off their children, they can do so and then leave without having to navigate crowded hallways and whatnot. And then the classroom itself, when you're setting up the interior of the classrooms, again, the layout of the room, certain behaviors such as eloping. So are you going to put the desk right next to the door so the child can easily get up and run out of the room? Restroom procedures and security procedures. And what I mean by that is, what are your safety measures around those things? So if you have a child who needs to use the restroom, and especially those that might need a lot more assistance, what are your rules around that? I always, for restrooms and things like that, a 2-to-1. So what I mean by that is 2 adults to 1 child, never just a 1-to-1 in the bathroom. And starting out, you might want to have a procedure that says, hey, we actually don't do any toileting. We realize that that's a need, but for right now, we just would prefer parents to handle the toileting. And parents get that. They really, really do. So that's actually what my church had to do in the beginning, because we weren't staffed enough to be able to have 1 student leave with 2 adults every time they had to use the bathroom. Intake forms, and I will input that at the end of this so you can screenshot it. That's just basically something that says, here's a form. This way, when your student arrives, I can be prepared to best meet their needs. And what that looks like for me is, if a parent fills it out ahead of time and they tell me their child loves music, loves trains, hates goldfish crackers because the texture of them bothers them, then you know what? When that student comes, I have trains ready. Goldfish crackers are gone. They've never existed ever. And we're going to play some music around the lesson that we're learning that day. It also helps to tell me how this child might operate with other children. And so maybe if some of their favorite things are things that other kids dislike, I know to keep those kids a little bit separate. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they hate music and music agitates them. Well, I'm going to have noise canceling headphones ready in case some noises are too loud for them. But also, for that lesson, we're probably going to skip music time. So those are just a brief overview of intake forms. Labeling items with words and pictures so students can be as independent as possible when locating items. Maybe consider stations. So this is where we do listen to music for those students who enjoy that, or maybe another area of the room might be a more calming area where you read books. Consider some alternative seating, and what I mean by that is, do you just have regular church chairs, the plastic kids ministry chairs, or can you purchase some yoga balls? Maybe some students want a stool. Other students might want to sit on a carpet square. Again, what is the intent of the lesson? Is it that they sit in a plastic chair, or is it that they learn what the Bible has to say? I have lots of alternative seating, and a lot of times I also enjoy that alternative seating. And then, yes, as we discussed, keeping in mind the intent. So I am just going to include these intake forms here for you to screenshot and edit. So as far as security for children with disabilities, background checking, all volunteers. That might be difficult for minors. I know sometimes you can't do that. The background checking all volunteers, having ongoing conversations with parents, and thinking through the what ifs and how to avoid problems. So let's say you have a student who likes to run, thinking through what can we do to prevent that child from running? What are we going to do if a buddy doesn't show up? Those types of things. Letting church security team know, hey, we have Jimmy. Jimmy likes to run. This is what Jimmy looks like. If Jimmy runs, here's what you do and here's what you don't do. And then just back to that topic of having conversation with parents. If it's a behavior that's typical and not a problem behavior, sometimes I don't share that with a parent. And what I mean by that is not encouraging lying or withholding information at all. But if Jimmy always screams all the time, and that's just normal for Jimmy, you don't need to remind his mom every time she picks him up that Jimmy screamed all class long because Jimmy's mom already feels like a burden on the church. And just to constantly remind her of that might cause him to not come back. So unless it's like a real safety concern or something that I really feel like the family needs to know, sometimes I don't share every detail that happened in class.
Visual aids and tools. Something that I use every single time I teach is a first then board or a first then statement. And what this looks like, I'll show you an example in a moment, is it says first we're doing task XYZ and then we're doing the next task. So first we are working with the teacher and then we are getting a break or then we are doing music. Redirects and prompts just assist to help the student to stay on task and shift their attention back to what is happening in the present time. And then schedules are also a very helpful tool. It eases students' anxiety about what's coming next, when are my parents coming back, and those types of things. And schedules are very relatable to the first then board. Schedules can be something that's just posted on the board or on the wall, but other students might need their own specific schedule and they might prefer to carry it with them. Another tool is picture cards. Picture cards are helpful for a number of reasons. One, you might work with students that do not communicate by talking, and this allows them to point to what they need rather than having to say it. It's also good to label bins and things with words and pictures. Picture cards just also allow students to advocate for themselves and tell you what they need. And there are lots of ways to use picture cards. If you're doing a schedule or a first then board or something like that, you could either prep that ahead of time or at the beginning of the class, you could sit down with your student, lay out all the card options as you see here. Then you could work with that student to put them in the correct order in the sequence of what's going to happen in the day. And then you could use the schedule as a visual tool to help them to know what's coming next. And so an example of this with students that I work with frequently is let's say they really want to get to music and they just keep thinking we're going to jump to music. In this example here, I could remind them that we're doing hockey table, we're reading, we'll get a water break, and then we have music. And I'll ask them, which one are we on now? And they might say, we're on lesson. Okay, so lesson, then water, then music. And I would have them point to which one they are on.
This is an example of the first then boards that I use in my classroom. And here I have 3 steps: first, next, and then. This is the choice board that the students are allowed to pick what they want to work for. And so I chose to work for music. So first I would work with teacher. Next I would do arts and crafts, and then I would have earned my reward of music. Some other examples of lesson modifications might include things like puzzles, picture cards, Velcro. I'm going to show examples of all of these, but dry erase pockets, music, silly putty slime, Play-Doh. And so let me show you some examples of these. I will frequently use what a child likes and or dislikes to help motivate the work. So for example, if a student loves the color purple, someone in my classroom loves purple, I will try to incorporate purple as much as possible in the lesson. And that means letting them use purple crayons to color, or letting them use the purple sheet protector, or giving them the purple chair. Some other modifications might be some flexible seating. So again, what's the intent of the lesson? Is it to learn about Jesus, or is it to sit in the right chair at the right time? So here is
just a simple thing I do in class. This is with a Bible verse, trust in the Lord with all your heart. You could also do this with lesson themes, so such as God made the sun, the moon, and the stars. You could have them put that in the correct order. And a simplified version, if that is too long, could just be to keep it short and say, trust in the Lord. Another idea is to use the metal baking sheets and magnetic tiles. And so you could ask the students, hey, what did God make on this day of creation? And they could spell it out. I have a student who loves doing this. If a child likes Legos, which who doesn't, or blocks, you can use a dry erase marker to write on the blocks. I have a student who loves trains, so we turned the Legos into a train just to keep them interested in the lesson. And then we had talked about the use of puzzles and things like that. So just using simple everyday tools. This is a puzzle of fish. And so if we were talking about creation and that God made the fish, we could do a fish puzzle together and talk about that. Who made the dolphin? God made the dolphin. These are the dry erase pockets that I was referring to. You can find these on Amazon or Walmart. And you can print out different things and put them inside. You give a kid a worksheet, they're bored to death. You give a kid a worksheet in a pocket protector with a colored expo marker of their choice, and suddenly it's a game. So how many stars do you see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Who made the stars? Can also flip it over and they can just doodle or color. And again, this is the purple sheet protector with the option of a purple expo marker for one of my students at my church. You can also just use these cheaper options, especially if you have a student that might rip or break things. These would be another way to do that. Another simple tool option, little letter beads and pipe cleaners. So again, we have the colors. I was missing lots of A's, so this didn't exactly work for the sake of the video. But you could let the student choose the color pipe cleaner that they wanted and have them string on the statements onto the pipe cleaner. And this is just reusable. Take the beads back off and do it again. But what did we learn today? We learned that God made the stars, and then they could do that with the beads. You can also hide beads or little objects in therapy putty or silly putty. So here we have a fish bead that I hid in here, and I could give this to a student and say, find the beads, and they could find them, and there's actually 2 in this one. So they could find the bead. Who made the fish? God made the fish. And then we could count how many they found. So how many fish did you find? I found 2. God made the fish. Running with our topic of creation and God making the fish, you can also list out all the different types of sea animals and fish that God made by using an expo marker on your table. Be careful with this one because sometimes parents get a little worried that their child's going to come home and do this, but it comes off, I promise, as modeled here. So let's practice. Let's say you receive an intake form on a new student and you learn that this student loves Legos, but they can be triggered by loud noises and music. How can you incorporate Legos into this student's learning? You could tape words from a verse to Legos and have the student stack the Legos in the order of the verse. And then if able, the student could skip the music time, or if the classroom's still going to do music time, you could take that student to the sensory room or another room for a break. And our second one, your church doesn't currently have any children with disabilities, but you want to pursue disability ministry. What are some steps you can pursue? You could make sensory bags or bins to have ready in case you do receive a student, and you can also create an intake form in preparation for the new student's arrival.
I hope that this has been helpful. Again, I am just so honored and thrilled that you would take the time to make your children's ministry more inclusive. If you have any questions about any of this, or if you need additional coaching or resources, feel free to reach out to me. My email is listed here, Katie at thebanquetnetwork.com, or you can check out our website. But again, just thank you, and I hope that you feel better equipped and ready to have your children's ministry be more inclusive.